Appalachia. Everybody in the world has a reaction to that word. It makes folks think everything from beautiful mountaintop views to dangerous hillbillies running through the woods with a rifle in one hand and a jug of shine in the other, all the way over to trailer parks, drugs, and blame near everything in between all of that. The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountains in the world. They once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretch along the eastern U.S. from Canada through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. The folks that live in these mountains have seen and endured enough things that have happened to make a preacher cuss. Hello, I'm Larry Bentley, and I was born in the Appalachian Mountains of southwest Virginia, and I was raised there by folks who lived for generations right there in the heart of them old mountains. Come with me and we'll take a look at some of the odd, awful, and legendary things that happen within my beloved mountains, and we'll be traveling around a bit, looking through the eyes of an old Appalachian at some of the crazy that spread itself all around the area as well. Welcome to Season 6 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Howdy, my good friends. I hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for stopping by. Call your mom and them and gather up because I can't stay shut up no more. So here we go with Season 6. This is one that I got through word of mouth, handed down by a couple of generations of family that, well, shall we say, know things. Now, you've heard me say that many times probably that the Appalachian Mountains have what we call a memory. What I mean by that is that when something bad happens in a holler, well, that holler will hold that energy, and if you come from the mountains, you can tell when you walk up on a place that's holding on to something like that. Well, if you walk deep enough into the briars of Scott County, Virginia, past the places where the logging trails hit the deer paths, you can still feel the weight of what happened back then in the 1920s there. To the folks that lived in the shadows of them Blue Ridge Mountains back in the 20s, the rules had changed. It wasn't something that somebody wrote in a book in Richmond or D.C. that changed everything. These rules were a thing of blood, soil, and the slow drip of a copper pipe. Back in the 1920s, the law around them parts had a name, and that name was James Holland Rose. Now, Hall, as he was known, wasn't your typical federal agent. He didn't come around them parts with polished shoes and a big city attitude. He was actually a son of them mountains that knew the difference between the scent of a blooming sourwood tree and sour fermented rot sour mash in a barrel hid off in the rhododendron somewhere. Now, to the moonshiners, he wasn't just a revenuer. He was a phantom sent to haunt them hollers. Back then, it was a time when the world was changing, but the Appalachian Mountains were digging in their heels. Prohibition had turned the quiet craft of the moonshine still into a bloody business. Now, the old-time blockaders, as they were known, were the ones that, made a little shine to pay the land taxes or maybe to have on hand for medicinal purposes. Now, most of the time, revenuers just left them folks alone. But by the 1920s, they were being pushed out by the hard breed of men who, due to a descended family, who may still be in that area, we'll call the Miller clan. Now, the Millers ruled the area around Big Stone Gap with an iron grip that was wrapped around a lead pipe. Now, they didn't just make whiskey, they made widows in the process. Weren't nobody in their territory going to make whiskey but them. Folks talked about it in the general stores that the Millers had struck a deal with the devil, or at least what would pass for him up in New York City. Now, the Mountain Dew was being swapped out for money, Tommy guns, and fast cars. Hall rose due the risks. He'd seen the bodies of other agents dragged out of the brush with their badges still pinned to their chests as a final insult. But he had a streak of stubbornness that ran as deep as a vein of coal. So come on in, take your shoes off, set a spell, and I'll tell you a good one from my own backyard in the Blue Ridge Mountains. On one of them early Appalachian spring mornings back in 1920, when the frost was still hanging on the pines like a shroud, Hall set out on a still hunt. He didn't take the main road. Now, he moved a whole lot like a mountain lions do, low, silent, and skirting them ridges. He was looking for the Devil's Bathtub, which is a natural smooth rock swimming hole at the head of Devil's Fork in Scott County, Virginia. The Devil's Fork, a big stony creek, is where the water runs cold enough to crack a man's teeth. If you ain't never been there to see it, well, that hike ain't for everybody. By the time you get there, you're going to swear you hiked 15 miles. I've never looked into how far it actually is, but I was told that it was more like about 7 miles. Anyway, that's where the Miller still was said to be. So as he climbed that trail, the air changed from that good old mountain air, the smell of fresh pine. It was all replaced with something a mite pungent but sweet. It was a smell known as the perfume of the Appalachian underground. Sure enough, there was the Miller still shining like a penny. But Hall wasn't alone. In them hills, folks say the trees have eyes. Sure enough, as Hall reached for his notebook to paperwork up the still sight, the silence was broke with the crack of a dry branch. If you've been out there and heard that happen, it sounds like a crack of thunder. Now, it wasn't but a second before Hall felt the cold iron of a shotgun barrel pressed against the nape of his neck. Then he heard the voice of Elias Miller, a man with a heart about as black as soot, say, "You're a long way from home, revenuer. We don't much care for tax collectors in these parts." Hall didn't pray or beg. He just took a big slow breath of that mountain air and said, "Elias, you can pull that trigger, but when you kill a man in a place this old, he don't stay dead. You make him part of the fog. I promise you I'll be the mist that chokes off your fire every night until the day you die." Now, for a second, Elias, he hesitated. And the Appalachians, a curse carries a right smart bit of weight. Heck, maybe even more than a bullet. But that second was all Hall needed. He spun, whipped his heavy canvas duster like a wing, like Batman does, and swept that shotgun barrel straight up, and the blast shredded all the hemlock limbs above him, and then Hall threw himself backwards over the limestone shelf and into the laurel thickets below. Now, if you've ever been in a mountain laurel slick, imagine a cage made out of iron, rebar, and leather. To a man that don't know them, they're probably a tomb. But Hall rose, they were a sanctuary. He crawled through the leaf mold, moving with the predator's patience, and above him, the woods erupted in gunfire. The thwack of the bullets hitting the wood sounded like a woodpecker on crack. Now Elias screamed, "Find him! I want his badge on my mantelpiece by sundown." But Hall was gone. He knew he couldn't get back to his Ford Model T because they'd have men waiting on the switchbacks. His only hope was to hide in the dark bottoms where the sun hits the ground only about 2 hours a day. By the time the moon rose over the ridges, Hall was shivering from that mountain air at night because we all know that it'll eat the heat right out of your bones. He saw a flicker of orange light in the distance, and he realized it was Granny Althea's cabin. Granny Althea was what us hillbillies call a granny witch. Now, folks about that area called her the Sin Eater. Hall eased up and saw Granny sitting on the porch snapping her a mess of green beans. She said, "I see you, James Rose. Come on up here. You got that smell of the Millers on you." She didn't even look up from her green beans. Then she said, "And the smell of the grave, too." No telling how old Granny was. Some said she was 100 years old by then. Her voice sounded a whole lot like wind through dry corn husks. Hall leaned against the front porch post, catching his breath. Granny stopped snapping, reached into her apron, and pulled out a poultice, which is, dried up bundles of herbs tied with usually a red string. Now, she looked up at Hall, and he saw her eyes were whited plumb over with cataracts, but she still stared right at him like she could see him just plain as day. And then she said, "The Millers think they own the creek, but the creek belongs to the mountain. If you want to stop them, you can't fight like a lawman. You have to fight like the fog." Then she threw the poultice to Hall and said, "Use it. You'll know when the time's right." Oh, for 3 days, the hillbillies in them mountains held their breath. The millers scoured the hollers, their dogs howling until their throats were raw. They threatened to burn Granny's outbuildings, but they never touched them or her cabin. Even a man as godless and mean as Elias Miller knew better than to cross the Sin Eater. They never found Hall Rose. He'd moved on for the time being anyway. He had another still to find over in North Carolina. Now, about a year went by, and Hall was back in Devil's Fork and moving like a ghost this time. On his first night back, he snuck into the Miller camp and ruined their copper worms by punching holes in them. Then he poured kerosene in their mash. On the second night, he found their New York connection. I reckon that wasn't hard to do with him driving around in the mountains in a new car wearing a pinstripe suit. Hall left him, suit and all, hanging by his feet 10 feet in the air in a hickory snare trap as he drove off in his car. By the third day, Elias Miller was like a wounded boar, hotter than a fresh fried fritter and twice as dangerous. Hall let him stew in his own torment that day. By the fourth day, the whole thing was coming to a head at the Devil's Bathtub. The Millers were moving what stock they hadn't ruined or been ruined by the kerosene out for a big shipment. They'd barricaded that thin little holler, making it a death trap. Now Hall stood on the ridge looking down, he and his 45 in his hand and Granny's herbs in his pocket. Now there were 10 men with shotguns and Thompson machine guns working around the still. A storm was rolling in off the mountains, what we call a toad strangler. Now the sky turned that odd dark blue-green color just before the clouds busted open. Hall dropped a round in the pipe of his 45 and said, "Well, Elias, you think you know the law? I'm fixing to show you the whole blame book." Now the thunder shook the foundation of that ridge and rain fell in sheets, hard enough and cold enough to bruise your skin. Now I've had that happen too. Now, down in the bottom, the Millers were getting ready to panic because the water was rising. Elias stood in the chaos holding the Thompson, yelling, "Move it! Get that liquid gold out of here." Hall came straight down the rock face like a spider. He wasn't even a man anymore. He was a shadow. He reached the clearing just as lightning struck a dead pine tree. In that flash, Elias saw him and screamed, "There!" Then he leveled that Thompson machine gun and let her rip. The gun shredded the air, but Hall disappeared behind a great big oak tree. He remembered Granny's poultice, and he was close enough to where he could throw it right into the moonshine fire before the rain finished choking it off. A thick, oily smoke poured out of the fire. The smoke was so thick that the rain couldn't cut it. It was like tear gas and stung the eyes and burned the throats of the whole Miller clan. "And I can't see him," one of the Millers yelled before he stood shooting blind. "Now hold your fire," Elias screamed, "before you kill one of us." But the panic had already set in. Hall moved through the smoke like a reaper. He didn't even fire his Colt. He wasn't a butcher, he was the law. He disabled all the trucks and sliced the tires. He dismantled the world piece by piece, and with them choking on Granny's smoke. Finally, the smoke cleared enough for Hall and Elias to be standing face to face. Looked like high noon in the mountains with them standing about 20 feet apart, with the water swirling around their ankles as the creek busted its banks. Elias drew out a long bowie knife and said, "You're a persistent ghost, Rose." Hall told him, "The law don't stay buried, Elias." That's when Elias lunged at Hall. For a big man, he moved like a falling rock. Hall fired once, catching him in the shoulder, but the momentum carried the both of them into the freezing water of the Devil's Bathtub, and they went under, all tangled up in one of them big dog knot fights right there in the dark. Hall remembered Granny's words, "The creek belongs to the mountain." Now he stopped fighting in the current and let the water take him, and he used that force to kick off a rock and drive his knee into Elias's gut. Elias started to swallow a lungful of that icy water, so Hall grabbed him by the collar and dragged him up the muddy bank. Now, when the sun finally topped the ridge the next morning, the storm had passed. The sky was clear, smelling like that fresh-washed mountain smell we all know, and a convoy of federal trucks wound its way up the mountain. They were finally able to get through all the washed-out roads. Now, when they got to the Devil's Bathtub, they found a sight that would be talked about for about 100 years or more. They found a hog-tied, shivering Elias Miller and his whole clan. The New York man with his pinstripe suit was gone. Some say he ran through them woods and all the way back home, left his car and all. The lead marshal climbed out of his truck, his face pale as a ghost. He looked over and thought he caught a glimpse of Agent Hall Rose sitting on a confiscated whiskey crate, smoking his pipe. Then he looked at the prisoners and asked them who did this. Elias told him it was that Agent Hall Rose. He said that Hall moved like a fog. My bullets went through him and my knife wouldn't cut him. The marshal turned back to where he thought he saw Hall and said, "Jim, is that you?" The marshal was shaking all over. He didn't move and didn't move any closer either. He just reached in his vest pocket and pulled out a wrinkled up piece of paper. It was a telegrammed report. He read the report to Elias and his clan. It said Agent James Holland Rose was ambushed on a trail near Mount Mitchell, North Carolina, about a year ago. He was shot through the heart and killed. The marshal told him that he'd attended the funeral and saw the casket lowered into the grave and watched him put that North Carolina red clay all over Hall's casket. When Elias heard that, he let out a scream that echoed through the holler for a mile. He looked at the crate where he thought he saw Hall sitting, and the crate was empty. Hall's duster was sitting on the ground beside the crate, shredded from knife slashes and shot full of bullet holes. There was a thin trail of white mist drifting up toward the hemlocks. Now, the marshal walked over to the crate. Hall's pipe was sitting there on the crate, still smoking. Hall's badge was there, too. It was tarnished and covered in a thin layer of what looked like North Carolina red clay. Now, the folks of Big Stone Gap went back to making a little bit of their recipe to help pay the taxes and have a little on hand for medicine. Hall Rose stayed a revenuer just long enough to finish the job he'd started, because here in the mountains, a legend never dies. Sometime it just waits for the fog to roll in to settle a score. I hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast, or if you're watching on Spotify, YouTube, or Rumble, throw us a like, and don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you watch or listen. Come on over to Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend podcast group on Facebook, where we talk Appalachian or about anything else you want to talk about. And I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian Murder, Mystery, or Legend. I will see you then.